General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur was the greatest man of the 20th century. An incomparable military genius, he was awarded every medal for bravery under fire that the nation can bestow. He was also a statesman. He symbolized honor, integrity, faith in God, love of country, devotion to duty. He was a discriminating man. Something in him kept him aloof from the pettiness and greed of the faceless crowd. A generation whose political and intellectual leaders teach idolatry of the average man, whose clamor for equality does not mean impartial justice, but enforced leveling of all to dull mediocrity, who have rejected individualism for collectivism, desperately needs a Douglas MacArthur. If other hands do not take up and hold high the flaming torch that MacArthur bore, then his death is an irreparable loss to civilization. That is a summary of my report on General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. The full report after a message from my sponsor. On April 5, 1964, the greatest man of the 20th century went to his rendezvous with God. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. The old soldier had fought the good fight. His course was run. It was time for him to go. Yet his death is a heavy loss to the world. MacArthur symbolized honor, integrity, faith in God, love of country, devotion to duty. He was a discriminating man. He stood apart from the common herd, not because he was contemptuous of any human being, but because something in him kept him aloof from the pettiness and greed of the faceless crowd. A generation whose political and intellectual leaders teach idolatry of the average man, whose clamor for equality does not mean impartial justice, but enforced leveling of all to dull mediocrity, who have rejected individualism for collectivism, desperately needs a Douglas MacArthur. Was he the last of the breed? There is the question which troubles those who could comprehend his greatness. If other hands do not take up and hold high the flaming torch that MacArthur bore, then his death is an irreparable loss to civilization. For incomparable service to his country as a soldier in 3 wars, he was awarded every medal for bravery under fire that the nation can bestow, countless non-combat awards from more than 30 nations around the world. In February 1937, General MacArthur warned President Roosevelt that Japan was an aggressive military threat and that the Soviets were involved in Japanese machinations. Roosevelt ignored the warning, but the soldier was right. Operations of Soviet agents in Japan as well as in the United States and other Western nations influenced policies to the end of deflecting Japanese aggression away from Soviet territories toward American, British, and Dutch. A result was our war with Japan. MacArthur was in the Philippines when Japan attacked, December 7, 1941. 3 days later, at a time when general confusion and anxiety were at the pitch of hysteria, when America's Pacific Fleet was knocked out and the vast Pacific seemed a Japanese lake, MacArthur clearly saw and calmly stated that Japan was recklessly overextended. In scattering her forces southward against the British and Americans, gambling on surprise to bring sudden conquest, Japan had left herself defenseless against attack from Soviet bases in the north. The Soviets were dependent on our help in Europe and could not have denied us permission to use their Siberian bases for strikes at Japan, as MacArthur suggested. But again, the great general's advice was ignored in Washington. There is no indication that the Roosevelt administration even asked to use Soviet air bases in Siberia. MacArthur's masterstroke would have saved thousands of American lives lost in the savage, island-hopping war of the Pacific. But the golden opportunity which he saw and reported 3 days after Pearl Harbor was not seized. Though Japan struck us, we retaliated against Germany to give maximum help to England and the Soviets in Europe, permitting our Soviet ally to maintain a treaty of peace with Japan throughout the war. In comparison with the manpower and material we poured into the European theater, MacArthur was on short rations in the Pacific. Yet it was in the Pacific, thanks to MacArthur's genius, where the most brilliant maneuvers were conceived and executed. Never enjoying full support from Washington, MacArthur waged a war in the Pacific which will be a classic example of military excellence until the last syllable of recorded time. After his message of December 10, 1941, urging that the Soviets be brought into the war against Japan, MacArthur dropped the subject. By the end of summer 1944, he realized that Japan, already whipped without Soviet help, should be permitted to surrender before the Soviets could enter. Dismissing MacArthur as our greatest general but poorest politician, Roosevelt went to Yalta and made deals which brought Stalin into a war we had already won. Immediate consequences were the shattered or lost lives of thousands who fell in the Pacific between February and August 1945, and the needless atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Longer-range consequences of delaying Japanese surrender until the Soviets were at leisure to enter a war they would not help fight were the Soviet rape of Manchuria, the communist conquest of China, and the war in Korea. In Korea, MacArthur's greatness as a general astonished the world. In brilliance and daring, the Incheon landing, which MacArthur conceived and successfully executed, has no parallel in the history of warfare. In Korea, 54,246 Americans died in vain because Truman rejected MacArthur's advice, shackled his efforts, and dismissed him from command. Longer-range consequences were the disasters in French Indochina, in Laos, in South Vietnam. After Korea, General MacArthur sounded a call to arms for all Americans to restore the crumbling foundations of their republic. Here are excerpts from one of the last major speeches the general made. Quote, "Taxes have grown so rapidly in recent years that now they are the largest single item in the cost of living. Americans will pay for government this year more than they will spend on food, clothing, medical care, and religious activities combined. Whether we want it or not, we pay now for almost unlimited government. A government which limits our lives by dictating how we are fed and clothed and housed, how to provide for old age, how the national income, which is the product of our labor, shall be divided among us, how we shall buy and sell, how long and how hard and under what circumstances we shall work. Our national indebtedness is now greater than the combined debt of all other nations on earth, and now our government this year proposes to spend as much as all other governments put together. Our swollen budgets are misrepresented to the public. Our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil at home, or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind government and furnish the exorbitant funds demanded. Yet, in retrospect, these dangers seem never to have been real. They never seem to have happened. Another of the great illusions is that government gives the people free much of what they get from its services. The painful truth is this: the government produces nothing of itself. Whatever it spends for people, it must previously take from the people in the form of taxes. Moreover, whenever the government gives a service to the people, it must at the same time take away from the people the right to provide and decide for themselves. And the amount which government doles back to the people or spends to promote their welfare is always only a fraction of what government has taken away from them because of the excessive costs of governmental administration. It is the little people, so-called, that pay the largest part of the bill. 85% of all the billions of dollars paid in income taxes comes from the lowest tax brackets. The contest for ages has been to rescue liberty from governmental power. The great patriots of the American Revolution revolted not so much against the actual taxes imposed upon them by a British king as against the concept of government behind the taxes, the concept that government had unlimited power to do what government thought proper. They had a deep suspicion that government, if permitted, would waste the labors of the people and ultimately curtail the power of the people, always under the pretense of taking care of the people. That is why they tried to bind the government down with a constitution, limiting the government's powers to the performance of carefully specified responsibilities. There are many who have lost faith in this early American ideal and believe in a form of socialistic totalitarian rule, a sort of big brother deity government to run our lives for us. They no longer believe that free men can manage their own affairs. Their central thesis is to take your money away from you on the presumption that a handful of men in government can spend the proceeds of your toil and labor to greater advantage than you who earned the money. Nowhere in the history of the human race is there justification for this reckless faith in political power. It is the oldest, most reactionary of all forms of social organization. It was tried out in ancient Babylon, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome, in Mussolini's Italy, and Hitler's Germany, and in all communist countries. Whenever and wherever it has been attempted, it has failed utterly to provide economic security and has generally ended in national disaster. It embraces an essential idiocy, that individuals who, as private citizens, are not able to manage the disposition of their own earnings become in public office supermen who can manage the affairs of the world. The old American philosophy of government more effectively promoted the ideal of human freedom with greater material abundance for more people than any governmentally planned system ever propounded. The fundamental and ultimate issue, however, is not merely our money. It is liberty itself. Excessive taxation of an overgrown government versus personal freedom, a least common denominator of mediocrity against the proven progress of pioneering individualism, the robot or the free man, end quote. That was a passage from one of the last major speeches of General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. May God rest his soul. Goodbye. God bless you. For printed documentation of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 454, the broadcast on General MacArthur.